Um, yeah, so like I was saying, feel free to ask questions. But to start things off, I think it'd be helpful if all of our panelists could briefly introduce themselves. So name, program, year, and affiliation, and then maybe also very briefly kind of speak on what a typical workday would look like for you, especially in terms of whether you do wet lab work or computational work or both, teaching, etc. Um, so, Nodar, I happen to be looking at you, so why don't we start with you?
No pressure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nodar. So I'm the only person on this panel who's not in a PhD program, but maybe soon, fingers crossed, I'm interviewing. So, but I'm a master's student doing my MS and FE at Columbia in the epidemiology department. So I do this program full time. I also work full time. So outside of Columbia, I am a director for clinical affairs for a medical device startup in the heart failure space. We're developing a device. So basically, I oversee our 2 clinical trials. And so when I saw work-life balance, I thought this was very appropriate from a little bit of a different perspective. But in addition, I also do TA as well. And so in terms of like kind of what a typical day looks for me is basically a lot of morning meetings, especially my work teams. A lot of them are based in Europe. And so meeting with those people in the mornings before I head up to campus for a class or for TAing, and also kind of juggling at the same time answering work emails. I'm lucky that my company and leadership is very understanding and allows me to do this both full time, because I know in many instances they're usually not. And so it's really just kind of juggling all these different responsibilities of going to class, doing assignments, working my thesis, working on other research that I'm involved in, but also obviously also overseeing these 2 clinical trials, which has its own kind of unique demands. Because I always joke with my colleagues as well as my partner, he's like, why don't you take some time off from work? And I say, what's the point? Because I am responsible for 2 clinical trials and there is no time off. Even if I am on vacation, I still have to answer emergency emails, either from our participating sites or some type of regulatory agency has some last minute questions. So it's kind of trying to juggle and also finding time to kind of wind down, if you will. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
All right, thank you. That sounds very intense. Why don't we go to Stephen next, if you don't mind?
Sure. Yeah, I can understand Nadar's trouble or troubles there. I was working full time in a master's program for some time. That was also very trying. Now I'm a 5th year student in a bioinformatics program at Temple University in Philadelphia. The other question, what was that? So that was my introduction. What was the other question?
Name, affiliation, and what a typical workday looks like for you in terms of time.
Yeah, so a typical workday for me, is I don't do any wet lab work at all. So it's all computational. So it's the way that I treat it personally is like an office job. I wake up, get ready, and then get on the computer and start reviewing any outstanding messages or emails that I might have, and then I have like a notebook that I use. I've been using it for years. It's called a Hobonichi Techo from Japan. So I write down, okay, what is one thing that I have to complete today, in order to count this day as a success. And so that's like the first thing that I do every morning. And then, if I just complete that one thing, then I'm happy. If I do other things, that's great. But so then after that, I set out a plan on how to, achieve that goal, whether that's, implementing a new feature or fixing an issue that somebody contacted me about, and communicating with members of my lab on Slack, any issues that they may come across, etc. So that's a typical work day. I mean, I'm on my computer all day long. So
Okay. Well, thank you. And certainly that piece of advice about uh, establishing a written goal at the beginning of every day. You hear variations on that from many people. So it sounds like it's a popular approach. Leah, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Actually, before I forget, Stephen, could you put the name of that journal in the chat?
yeah, sure.
But I
Yeah,
don't know how to
Others
spell
might be
it.
interested.
of course. Yeah. Hobonichi.
Thank
Okay.
you. I'm a sixth-year student at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Mathematics. My research, as you saw, is modeling infectious diseases with math, particularly cholera. I've done a little bit of work with ecological models looking at evolutionary equations, but primarily it's just been that cholera model. I do something, I mean, it would be ambitious to say it's too similar to what Stephen does, because it's definitely a work in progress in terms of just trying to continue to learn how to schedule my day and stick to it. Something that I had to develop really quickly during COVID, because it kind of pushed us all in a hole that we had. There's a lot of self-knowledge to be gotten from that, but also that comes at a, sometimes very expensive price of the painful aspects of self-knowledge when you learn the character flaws you have that weren't readily noticeable before. So I start my day, I usually work 9 to 5, maybe 9 to 6, just depending on how things go. But I start my day much earlier, just to kind of get myself settled. I like to, do a chore or something in the morning to sort of transition from, okay, I woke up kind of tired. I don't want to go straight to work, and get into the swing of things. Let me do something that's easy, like emptying the dishwasher or washing, like, I don't know, 3 dishes, to give yourself that sense of accomplishment that you can then build upon by doing harder and harder things. So when I actually sit down with my work, maybe it's really intimidating for me to open up my computer and work on writing my dissertation. So maybe I open up my computer and say, okay, well, you've been wanting to improve your Python skills, so why don't you try to work a little problem in Python? And the trick with that is sometimes you can spend way too much time doing that if you get stuck. But the idea is that if you do just a little bit of it, do something that's a little bit more fun, but still a little bit more challenging than just doing the dishes or the laundry, you can kind of then continue that upward momentum to the point where it's not that intimidating to get started on like the hardest task. That's what works for me. And then in the evenings, sometimes if I have stuff to catch up on, I'll do that, but mostly that's reserved for time with my husband, friends, just unwinding, exercise. That's a very important thing for me, to make sure I don't go crazy and kill myself or somebody else, So that's definitely a very important thing I incorporate into my day. So
That sounds like a pretty strong routine. I can definitely sympathize about the COVID working from home pain. Yeah, it was a learning experience. Okay, so Robert, you're our last panelist. Do you want to speak a little bit as to your current activities and your typical workday?
Yeah, thanks for the invite. So I'm the odd one out. I actually finished my PhD back in 2019, in a very non-traditional approach as well. I've worked in industry for almost 15 years before going back for a PhD. And then I started with Penn State right before the pandemic hit. And then during the pandemic, because I found I actually had too much time on my hands, I went back for another master's degree. In terms of time management, a lot of the skills I picked up back when I was working in industry. So like a lot of things that people already said kind of applicable, having some sort of plan, having some sort of schedule for what you want to do, setting time to the side to not think about work, but simultaneously a lot of my collaborators are around the world. So there are times where, during the pandemic, there was a conference and it was in Europe. So I was up at 3 a.m. giving a presentation. So with international collaboration, sometimes it is what it is.
Okay, so you got sort of the industry strategy, and you brought that to your PhD and kind of used that to organize your schedule. Okay. Well, so it sounds like at least some of you have a pretty like typical and defined strategy for how you go about your work schedule. But maybe each of you could comment on, you know, how strict you are with that schedule and what you do when it seems like a certain deadline just isn't going to happen within those hours, or you have to maybe identify which projects might need to get put on the back burner to make something else happen. You know, when sort of things are getting compressed and the pressure is on, like what are your strategies or tips that you might have for others in that situation? And anyone who would like to take that first can just leap in.
What I found for myself has been really useful is actually thinking outside of work, like things that I have deadlines for, and actually scheduling in time with myself just to like decompress, because sometimes I find myself working for 18 hours and I'm like, I'm going to burn out if I continue doing this. So last semester, I was very intentional with literally going into my calendar that's synced with everything and literally scheduling, like, no joke, 2 hours to go, I don't know, go for a run and like make food or go run errands, and making sure nothing interrupts that time in terms of like work or school. And then building off of that, also setting aside time in my schedule just for like the weekly stuff I know I have to do, whether it's grading or just working on like class assignments or my thesis, or even last semester, like my PhD applications, I purposely set aside like 2 hours every Saturday in the morning when I know I'll be pretty well rested by then. I can get up, go to a coffee shop and just kind of like hunker down and work through those applications. I mean, I found that to be really useful. But when it comes to like deadlines with work deadlines, there kind of is no plan B. Typically, some of those deadlines are set by like regulatory agencies. I just have to meet those deadlines. So sometimes it means setting kind of fake deadlines for myself and saying I plan on personally finishing this a week before. That way we can get it in by time. And sometimes I'll forget I even do that. So it's a good thing. Then I'll be like, oh wait, I actually have one more week to finish if it gets to it. When it comes with other, just like, if you will, like passion projects or like other research that I'm working on with my collaborators, it means like if it's like a week out and I just don't think I'm going to get it done, it's just reaching out and letting them know ahead of time. And usually you'll find out that they also are very much behind and would actually appreciate to also extend this arbitrary deadline you both agreed on. And so I think in those instances, communication is very much key, because I think sometimes we're worried to reach out to collaborators, like they might be disappointed, but I think everyone in the world is always behind on some things. We all take on a lot. And so I think just having the open dialogue with the people you're collaborating with, even with like my thesis advisor, some weeks I'm like, you know what, I didn't get much done. Can we just meet next week, or like the next meeting we have scheduled? She's like, no problem, it's fine. So I think just having the open dialogue and just, you know, realizing it's okay to say, I'm not going to get this done, and just kind of accepting that. Sometimes we like guilt ourselves into it, and it just turns into more of a big issue than it has to be.
Yes, I've certainly also found that you, as soon as you tell your advisor you're behind schedule, you immediately feel better. Yeah, so communication, very important. It sounds like you also try to really strictly schedule, not necessarily work maybe, but the things that aren't work, to make sure those actually happen. So, yeah.
I like the what you said about, like, you know, telling your advisor, like, you know, I'll have this done by this time. And like I do the same thing. Like, even though something might be due in a couple weeks, I like to break it up, and like I'll say like I'll tell them I'll have this done by the end of the week, just so that they know, and it holds myself like accountable too. Like, even though I don't have to necessarily have it done by the end of the week, like saying that I have it, like send it out and email it, like, okay, I told them I'd finish it, so I will like work on finishing that.
Right. It's also a way to create accountability. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, Leah, you've unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah. For me, I think it comes down to distinguishing between what are hard and fast deadlines and what are, you know, movable ones. And the best way to plan for that is just to plan early and go over your plan often. So, you know, maybe, you know, as soon as you know that there's a deadline associated with whatever you're doing, like put it in your planner. And then, I mean, this is a strategy I've had to develop. This is not naturally how I like to approach things. But you put it in your planner and then you stop and think for a second, okay, what goes into this? Are there, like, is this just something like writing an abstract where, okay, I could probably pound that out in like, 15, 20 minutes and submit it if I forget about it, you know what I mean? Like, I don't need to remind myself 2 weeks in advance to work on this. Or is it something a little harder where, okay, like, 2 weeks in advance, I need to have X, Y, or Z done. And then maybe a week in advance, I need to make sure I have this done. What are the steps that have to go into that? So yeah, just a lot of very intentional planning.
You don't just focus on the deadline, but you focus on what is that due on the deadline so that you can work backwards and have enough time. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Stephen and Robert, do you want to contribute here?
Yeah, I'm going to echo the same point about knowing what the hard deadlines are that are outside the scope of anything you have control over. So when I was in the process of submitting my dissertation, there was a specific date that it had to be in if I wanted to graduate that semester. Nothing anybody could do about that. That was set by the university for whatever reason they had in mind. Other deadlines, like the soft ones for how much I want to get written on a certain pace or for programming things, a lot of those, what I've seen over the years is a lot of my colleagues get better over time at estimating how long it's going to take to do something. So a lot of things you get better with estimation with more experience. And one of the things that comes with the experience is usually realizing that you're not quite as good at something as you think you are. So I started out when I was a junior developer thinking, oh yeah, I can get this written in 48 hours. 6 months later, we finally got the task done. Part of that was all the externalities that came into play, and part of it was just my own optimism of I'm fresh out of my undergraduate, and I know everything there is to know about computer science, and then you find out you don't. But yeah, like planning and scheduling actually gets a lot easier with time. And a lot of people tend to be hard on themselves at first because you're very optimistic and you want to put these really aggressive timelines. And then you find a good mentor and your mentor tells you that the timelines that sound slow are actually the really optimistic ones for the experienced people. So I'd say part of this boils down to also making sure you have a good mentor. And sometimes our advisors are not necessarily the best mentors when it comes to actually planning things because they might have their own things in the back of their head of NSF grants, NIH grants, and everything else that they're trying to think of for timelines.
Right. Your dissertation timeline probably is not at the top of their set of dates they're worried about, certainly. So, thank you for that. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and I think everything has been covered in terms of what I was thinking as well. That I would reiterate that communication is extremely important. That as soon as as soon as you see that you're not going to be able to hit this deadline, the earlier the better that you speak to your team about that. The less stress it is, you can get more support from the team if need be, if a deadline needs to be met. It just gets more difficult the closer you get to the deadline if you do not communicate. And then as far as like estimating time, that's another in terms of my strategy. I'm not good at estimating when I'm going to be able to complete something. So sometimes people get offended, when they ask me, when do you think you'll have this done by? And I have a number in my head, and then I will say I'll multiply that by 3, just to at least get closer to what probably the actual finish date will be. And it could be longer than that, but multiplying by 3 seems to be a good strategy for me. So that's all I have to add there.
I've heard different different factors out there. You have 1.5, 2, you're going for 3, so maybe on the more conservative side. Okay, well, great. So following kind of from this, I've found that there are times where the stress of multiple things just sort of starts to build up, and there's kind of this runaway train effect where not only do I have all these deadlines, but I'm not working effectively because I'm so stressed. And it's certainly best to avoid those situations. Easier said than done, though. So Does the panel have any advice for students on how you recognize the signs of sort of the buildup of stress in yourself, and then if you do recognize that, what you can do to hopefully alleviate or prevent kind of a further compilation?
So certainly if you get to work and you open your computer and immediately start crying, that's probably a sign that you're a little burnt out.
Yeah, I would say so.
Thankfully, my husband works from home. I called him and he picked me up because I have an office with like 20 other grad students. And I was like, well, this is awkward. But before you get to that point, ideally, you can start to recognize it. And for me, that happens if I can't remember. I was just reading the term that they like to use in the news for it. Task paralysis, I think, when you open up your computer or you get to work and you just feel that like tightness in your chest, like a preliminary anxiety attack, about your tasks, or you can't even begin to think about a project because it's just this big gaping chasm in your mind. And you don't even have the mental strength to try to break it down into the smaller components that are part of it. I think all of that's kind of, for me, big indications of burnout. In which case it tells me I either need to go out and do some nice like high cardio exercise to kind of like reset my brain, or maybe just get outside if that's too intimidating, get outside and just have some fresh air, take a step away. Usually being on my phone is not a good thing to do at that point because that's a procrastination technique that is still like wearing you out. It's not truly restful. So I try to do something that's not super mentally engaging as far as like intellectually engaging, so to speak. Or maybe I go talk to a friend or a mentor. Those are all things that I like to do. And then once you kind of have control over yourself, look back and see, okay, where did it start to go wrong? Did I take on too much stuff? Am I not doing a good job of organizing my life to prioritize the tasks that need to get done versus the things that I want to do, and so on.
It will sound like really good pieces of advice, especially getting outside. That one almost always helps for me. All right, who else? Yeah, Nodar.
Yeah, so recreationally, I'm a distance runner. I've ran marathons and one ultra marathon. And so I kind of draw upon that where like, if I start to think, if I'm in mile 10 and like, I'm thinking about mile 20 already, I'm going to obviously start to panic because by then your body is already tired. And you're like, I do not want to even think about the next hour, 2 hours, however long it'll take me to get there. And so instead I focus on just right now, let me get to the next mile, the next quarter mile, and not worry about the larger task at hand. And so I kind of apply that to both work and school. It's funny because my friend yesterday joked that a PhD program is an extreme sport. And I could say the same just for grad school in general. And so applying that to just like when I have a really stressful week in terms of like different things I need to get done, I will recognize that I'm not getting anything done because I'll be sitting at my computer for an hour just kind of panicking and starting one email and then thinking about something else and starting something else, and then 10 minutes later jumping to another email and not actually getting anything accomplished. And so step back and literally just write down like what it is that I absolutely need to get done today, and then actually breaking that down into tasks. So like, I don't know, if it's writing an email, do I need to go research something for this email first? And then getting that off and then physically checking it off, because it's also just visually nice to see like you're getting things done. And it's kind of that positive affirmation that you're actually accomplishing something.
The intentional planning that Stephen was talking about as well. Really focusing in on the true priorities. Because sometimes you can procrastinate with the less scary but lower priorities. So all right.
I have a quick question for everyone in the meeting here. In addition to like the Hobonichi Techo, I was just wondering what other like tools people use to like, keep themselves on track. Like I really just have like a planner, and then I set like a timer for myself to like work for an hour at a time, like uninterrupted. But I was kind of wondering like if there are other things that people out there are using, to keep themselves on track during their workday.
Anyone feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same. I just use my iCalendar. So I have a MacBook. I use my iCalendar in terms of like scheduling out my days. So like blocking off time and then just like either a piece of paper for like tasks that I need to accomplish. Because I've tried using other apps and other systems, but I find that to actually add more stress just for me personally. Because
Yeah.
then I'm stressing out about actually filling that out.
Putting the
for the
tasks
for
in the app
example.
so you
Yeah.
can do the tasks. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just stick to what I've used
Yeah.
all the time.
Robert.
I was going to say the same thing because I tried some of those apps and techniques over the years, and the vast majority of them did not work for me. I know they work for some people, but me personally, when I was in a bit of a crunch towards the end of my dissertation, even just now when I have to do a lot of writing, my technique is usually just to find some good music that I can write to and a place where people are not going to bother me that much. And what that's defined as can depend on the person as well, because I actually wrote like the last 3 chapters of my dissertation sitting in the cafe at the library on campus. Theoretically, the worst possible environment to write, but threw some headphones on, had some music on, and was just able to sit there and write. So, some of the techniques, there's a lot of stuff that gets played up, and it's worth experimenting with all the different tools and techniques out there to find what works for you. But at the end of the day, it's at a certain point, it's like a matter of finding what works for you, and what works for you isn't necessarily going to be something that's talked about a lot. How many people think that like just listening to music and typing is an effective way of managing time?
Yeah, it's different for everybody. Like, and I like how you said it. I mean, you went to the library sometimes. Like, I'm always just in my room. So sometimes I like, going to a different like area, whether that be a cafe or a library, and seeing other people work sometimes motivates myself to work as well. So just like changing up the environment has also helped me sometimes as well.
Yeah, and
something I've heard people, sorry for interrupting, but I wanted to bring this up, even though I don't actually do this myself, like sort of like betting against yourself, like I have to get this done by this date or else I pay like $5 or $10 to like some charity or something like that. I don't actually do that, and I don't really know if I would really benefit from it, but I guess that is an option if you're if you have the financial means to say something like that to yourself and hold yourself to it.
Yeah, just trying to find ways to help yourself stay accountable.
And I've heard some people say that you should pick a charity that you actually don't like, so you really want to keep that money.
Or you give the money to someone, or something like that, instead of keeping it for yourself. Or well, we're at 2:01 here, so I guess if there are any like burning questions, as Alice asked before we wrap it up, please feel free to ask.